Have you ever wondered what happens when the hunters become the hunted? When 6 American soldiers, trained in the most sophisticated reconnaissance techniques on Earth, find themselves being tracked through the Vietnamese jungle by men who were born in that same forest. When every snap of a twig, every bird call, every shift in the wind could mean the difference between making it home and becoming another name on a black granite wall in Washington. Sergeant James "Jimmy" Dalton, just 24 years old from Asheville, North Carolina, felt the weight of the PRC-25 radio digging into his shoulders as he froze mid-step, one boot hovering inches above the jungle floor. The January heat pressed down like a wet blanket, but the cold sweat running down his spine had nothing to do with temperature. Behind him, 5 men, his men, had stopped moving the instant he did, their eyes scanning the green walls that surrounded them in every direction. Jimmy's wife Sarah was 7 months pregnant back home, expecting their first child in March. He'd promised her he'd be careful, promised he'd come home. But careful didn't mean much when you realized professional trackers were closing in on your position, and the nearest friendly forces were 15 kilometers away through hostile territory. If you're watching this, you recognize that military history isn't just about tactics and technology. It's about the men who executed those missions under impossible conditions. This channel exists to tell their stories with the accuracy and respect they deserve, without glorifying war or simplifying the choices they faced. Subscribe now and join those who refuse to let these experiences fade into footnotes.
January 1968 marked a critical moment in the Vietnam War, though nobody in-country knew it yet. The Tet Offensive was weeks away from changing everything, but in the meantime, the Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrols, LRRPs, continued their dangerous work deep in enemy territory. These 6-man teams represented the Army's eyes and ears, inserted by helicopter into remote areas of South Vietnam to gather intelligence on Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army movements. Jimmy Dalton's Team 3-2, operating out of Bien Hoa in 3 Corps, had been tasked with a straightforward reconnaissance mission: observe a suspected VC supply route near the Cambodian border, report enemy activity, and extract after 72 hours. Standard stuff for LRRP teams, who prided themselves on being the best-trained reconnaissance soldiers in Vietnam. They moved in small numbers, carried minimal equipment, and relied on stealth over firepower. The mission brief had been routine. The helicopter insertion had gone smoothly. For the first 18 hours, everything had gone according to plan. The Viet Cong trackers who picked up Team 3-2's trail weren't regular soldiers. They were specialists, men who'd spent years hunting in these jungles long before Americans arrived. The team leader, a wiry veteran in his 40s known to his men simply as Ba, had tracked French paratroopers in the 1950s and had been hunting American patrols since 1965. He commanded 8 men, all of them born within 20 kilometers of this exact stretch of forest. They knew every stream, every ridge, every animal trail. They knew how the wind moved through different elevations, how rain changed the ground, where foreign soldiers would instinctively choose to rest. When Ba's point man found the faint impression of an American jungle boot in soft earth near a stream crossing, the VC tracker studied it with the attention of a jeweler examining a diamond. The depth of the heel mark told him the soldier was carrying heavy equipment. The direction of travel pointed northwest, toward the border. The age of the track, barely 6 hours old, meant the Americans were still close. Bia looked at his men and gave a single hand signal. They weren't wrong to believe they'd have these Americans before nightfall. The jungle had taught them patience, and patience had taught them that even well-trained foreigners made mistakes when they didn't truly know the land. Jimmy Dalton had grown up hunting white-tailed deer in the Blue Ridge Mountains. and he'd thought that experience would translate well to Vietnam. In some ways, it had. He moved quietly, read terrain instinctively, understood the rhythms of wildlife. But the Vietnamese jungle was a different beast entirely. The density of vegetation, the humidity that muffled sound in unpredictable ways, the countless species of birds and insects whose calls he couldn't interpret. It was like being deaf and half-blind simultaneously. Still, Team 3-2 had completed 4 successful missions together. They trusted each other's skills. Jimmy carried a photograph of Sarah in his helmet band, taken at their wedding in Asheville 2 years earlier. She was smiling in that picture, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, completely unaware that her new husband would spend his 24th birthday crawling through jungle 14,000 kilometers from home. As the team settled into their observation position overlooking a suspected trail junction, Jimmy allowed himself to believe this mission would end the same way the previous 4 had. Quiet, professional, uneventful. He'd be back at Bien Hoa in 2 days, writing another letter home, counting down the 147 days remaining on his tour. The PRC-25 on his back felt reassuring, a technological umbilical cord connecting him to American firepower if things went wrong. Things weren't supposed to go wrong. The first indication came not as sound or sight, but as a feeling, that ancient primal sensation of being watched that evolution had hardwired into human nervous systems over millions of years. Jimmy felt the skin on the back of his neck tighten, felt his breathing become conscious instead of automatic. He slowly turned his head, keeping his body motionless, scanning the green wall behind their position. Nothing. No movement. No unnatural shapes or colors. But the feeling persisted, grew stronger, until it became a certainty that lived in his gut, like a cold stone. He keyed his radio handset twice, the team's silent signal for danger close, and watched as 5 heads turned toward him in perfect unison, their faces showing the same heightened alertness he felt coursing through his own veins. Then he heard it. Not a footstep or a weapon being readied, but the absence of sound, a silence that spread through the jungle like a wave, as if every bird and insect within 200 meters had simultaneously decided to hold its breath. That's when Jimmy knew for certain they'd been compromised. In the mountains back home, the woods went quiet when predators moved through. Here, the jungle was announcing the same truth in the same ancient language. Someone was hunting them, and whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. The team pulled back from their observation position with practiced efficiency, each man covering a different sector as they moved. Spec 4, Michael Torres, the assistant team leader, was already plotting an evasion route on his map when the first shot cracked through the canopy, a single AK-47 round that punched through leaves 2 feet above Jimmy's head. The message was clear. The VC trackers knew where they were and were announcing their presence. This wasn't an ambush meant to kill quickly. This was the beginning of a hunt, and the hunters wanted their prey to know they were coming. Jimmy's training kicked in automatically. He grabbed the PRC-25 handset and keyed it. Falcon X-ray, this is Rambler 3-2. Contact, over. The radio operator's voice came back calm and professional, but Jimmy could already taste the metallic tang of fear in his mouth, could already feel his heart hammering against his ribcage like it was trying to escape. Ba moved through the jungle with the confidence of a man who'd done this 100 times before. His point man had spotted the Americans' withdrawal, the disturbed vegetation, the broken spider web, the faint boot prints in decomposing leaves. They were heading northwest, probably trying to reach higher ground for extraction. That's what they all did, these Americans. They followed their training, which made them predictable. Ba signaled his men to spread into a loose pursuit formation. They didn't need to rush. The jungle would tire the heavily laden Americans within hours. The heat would dehydrate them. The terrain would slow them. And when they finally called for their helicopters, Ba's men would be waiting. He'd seen this dance play out before. The Americans had technology and training, but his men had something more valuable. They had the forest in their blood, in their bones, in their souls. Team 3-2 moved as fast as they dared, which wasn't nearly fast enough. The vegetation clawed at their uniforms, snagged their equipment, forced them into single file on barely visible game trails. Jimmy could hear his men breathing hard behind him, could hear the quiet metallic clinks of equipment, no matter how carefully they moved. The PRC-25 felt like it weighed 100 pounds, the straps cutting into his shoulders with each step. They'd covered maybe 300 meters when Torres touched Jimmy's shoulder and pointed. In the soft earth beside the trail, fresh boot prints, Vietnamese sandals made from tire rubber, the treads showing clearly. The prints were moving parallel to their route, about 20 meters off their left flank. The trackers weren't behind them. They were beside them. They were herding them. Jimmy made a decision that probably saved their lives. He abandoned the textbook evasion route and turned the team 90 degrees, plunging straight into the thickest vegetation he could find. If the VC wanted them on trails, then trails were exactly what they'd avoid. The jungle closed around them like a living barrier. Wait, a minute vines tore at exposed skin. Thorns drew blood. Visibility dropped to arm's length. But Jimmy pushed forward, trusting his compass, trusting his instinct, trusting that sometimes the hardest path was the safest path. Behind him, he could hear his men struggling through the vegetation, could hear the ragged breathing that signaled exhaustion setting in. They'd been moving hard for 90 minutes. The temperature hovered around 95 degrees, with 90% humidity. Canteens were going dry, but they couldn't stop, couldn't rest, couldn't let the hunters close the distance. When they finally broke through into a small clearing, really just a gap where an old tree had fallen and sunlight could reach the ground, Jimmy called a halt. His men collapsed where they stood, chests heaving, uniforms soaked through with sweat. Torres spread the map on the ground and studied it while Jimmy grabbed the radio handset. Falcon X-ray, Rambler 3-2 requesting immediate extraction. Over. The response came back laden with static, but clear enough to understand. All available helicopters were committed to another mission. Earliest extraction window was 6 hours. 6 hours. Might as well have been 6 years. Jimmy looked at his team. Young faces streaked with camouflage paint and sweat, eyes showing the first hints of the fear they were all feeling, but nobody would voice. 6 hours meant nightfall. Nightfall meant the VC owned the jungle completely. They needed a plan, and they needed it now. While Team 3-2 fought for survival in a jungle clearing, the larger war machine continued its relentless operations across South Vietnam. In Saigon, MACV headquarters tracked dozens of LRRP teams operating throughout the country, each one a small green pin on a large map, each one representing 6 lives hanging in the balance. The LRRP program had proven its value throughout 1967, providing intelligence that had prevented ambushes, revealed supply routes, and saved countless American lives. But that value came at a cost measured in young men who operated beyond the reach of conventional forces, who relied on stealth and speed rather than firepower, who understood that if things went catastrophically wrong, help might not arrive in time. Team 3-2's situation wasn't unique. Somewhere in Vietnam, a LRRP team was in trouble almost every week. The question was always the same. Would they have the skill, the luck, and the time to survive until extraction? The decision that changed everything came from Torres, not Jimmy. The assistant team leader had been studying the map with an intensity that blocked out everything else. The heat, the exhaustion, the fear. He tapped a spot with one dirty finger and looked up at Jimmy. "The trackers are herding us away from the LZ," he said quietly. "Every time we move, they push us further northwest. They want us tired, disorganized, and far from extraction when the birds finally come." Jimmy looked at the map and saw what Torres had seen. The VC were playing a long game, using the terrain and time as weapons. They weren't trying to kill Team 3-2 in a firefight. They were trying to position them for an ambush at the extraction site. It was brilliant tactical thinking, the kind that came from men who'd been fighting in this jungle for years. "So we stopped playing their game," Jimmy said. His mind was racing now, connecting pieces, seeing possibilities. The jungle didn't choose sides, it just waited. But maybe, just maybe, they could use the forest itself against men who thought they owned it. He gathered the team close and laid out a plan that was either genius or suicide, and nobody was entirely sure which. Instead of continuing to evade, they'd stop moving. They'd find the most defensible position available, set up a tight perimeter, and let the trackers come to them. But they wouldn't just wait passively. They'd do what LRRP teams did best. They'd gather intelligence, identify their hunters, and turn the tables. The PRC-25 would be their ace in the hole. When the time came, they'd call in everything the American military could throw at this piece of jungle. Gunships, artillery, fast movers if they were available. They'd make the forest itself betray the men who thought they knew it best. The team found their fortress in a cluster of bomb craters from an old B-52 strike, the depressions forming natural defensive positions surrounded by dense vegetation. They settled in with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who'd trained for exactly this scenario. Claymore mines went out on the most likely approaches. Fields of fire were cleared quietly, carefully. Every man knew his sector, knew his fallback position, knew what to do if things went sideways. Jimmy got on the radio and called in their position, requesting priority support when the shooting started. The duty officer at Falcon X-Ray wasn't happy about the situation, but he understood it. "Rambler 3-2, we'll have Cobra gunships on station in 40 mics, artillery plotting fire missions now. Hold what you've got, and keep us updated." 40 minutes felt like an eternity, but it was better than nothing. The team didn't have to wait long before the jungle showed its hand. Torres spotted the first VC tracker moving through the vegetation about 80 meters out. Just a brief glimpse of movement, a suggestion of human form in the green chaos. Then another, off to the left. Then a third, sweeping wide on the right flank. Ba's men were doing exactly what Jimmy had hoped they'd do. They were conducting a careful sweep toward what they thought was a fleeing enemy, maintaining dispersion, staying professional. They had no idea they were walking into a prepared position. The jungle had taught them to be patient hunters, but it hadn't taught them that sometimes the prey could think 3 steps ahead. The Americans had superior communications, superior firepower on call, and superior training in defensive tactics. The question was whether those advantages would be enough. The firefight started not with a bang, but with a controlled, devastating cascade of American firepower that turned a stretch of Vietnamese jungle into a killing ground. Jimmy waited until he had visual confirmation on at least 4 VC positions before he keyed the radio. Falcon X-ray, Rambler 3-2, fire mission over. The Artillery Fire Direction Center had been waiting for this call. Within 90 seconds, the first 105mm high explosive rounds were screaming overhead, impacting in the jungle 75 meters from Team 3-2's position. The sound was overwhelming, a physical pressure that compressed the air and made thought impossible. Trees disintegrated. Earth fountained skyward. The carefully plotted bracket of fire walked across the VC approach routes with methodical precision. Through the chaos, Jimmy could see the trackers breaking from concealment, their tactical discipline shattering under artillery fire they hadn't expected and couldn't counter. One man ran directly into the kill zone of a claymore mine. The devastating blast of 700 steel balls shredded vegetation and sent the VC soldiers sprawling. Ba was trying to reorganize his men, trying to execute a fighting withdrawal, but the jungle that had been their ally had transformed into a nightmare of exploding shells and American rifle fire. The Cobra gunships arrived 15 minutes later, their miniguns tearing through the canopy with a sound like angry gods ripping fabric. The pilots couldn't see much through the vegetation, but Jimmy's radio guidance put them close enough to scatter the remaining VC trackers. When the shooting stopped, the jungle had changed. What had been green and alive an hour before was now torn and smoking, the wounded earth showing through gaps in the canopy. Team 3-2 conducted a careful sweep of their perimeter. They found blood trails, equipment, spent shell casings, evidence that the hunters had paid a heavy price for underestimating their prey. Ba's team had withdrawn into the jungle, carrying their wounded, leaving behind only questions and the lingering smell of burned powder. The extraction helicopters came at dusk, their rotors beating the air into submission, their door gunners scanning the tree line for threats. Jimmy's team climbed aboard with the mechanical movements of exhausted men, the adrenaline crash hitting them all simultaneously. As the Huey lifted off and the jungle fell away beneath them, Jimmy looked back at the scarred earth. Somewhere down there, VC soldiers were tending their wounded, mourning their dead, and probably respecting the Americans who'd turned what should have been a simple hunt into a tactical disaster. The trackers had done everything right. They'd found their prey, pursued with skill, positioned for the kill. But they'd underestimated the technology gap, the communication advantages, and the defensive training that turned LRRP teams into something more than just 6 men with rifles. The tactical decisions made that day echo through military history. If you've seen this pattern in other battles, share your thoughts in the comments below. Veterans and history enthusiasts, your perspective matters here. Team 3-2 returned to Bien Hoa with minor wounds, cuts from vegetation, dehydration, exhaustion, but all 6 men walked off the helicopter alive. For a LRRP team compromised deep in enemy territory, that qualified as a major victory. Intelligence reports suggested BA's tracker team suffered 3 confirmed dead and at least 2 wounded, though exact numbers were impossible to verify. The VC didn't leave their casualties for American body counts, didn't report losses that could be intercepted and analyzed, but blood trails told their own story, and the story suggested that professional hunters had learned a harsh lesson about underestimating well-trained prey. Back at base, Jimmy sat on his cot and tried to write a letter to Sarah. His hands shook too badly to hold the pen steady. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a head full of images he couldn't escape. The artillery impacts, the sound of the claymore detonating, the glimpse of a VC soldier running through fire. He was alive. His men were alive. But the cost of that survival lived somewhere in his chest, a weight that had nothing to do with the PRC-25 radio. The PRC-25 sat in the corner now, silent, just another piece of equipment. During the fight, it had been a lifeline, his connection to American firepower and eventual salvation. Now, it just reminded him how thin the line was between mission accomplished and names on a wall. Somewhere in the jungle, Ba sat with his surviving men and conducted a different kind of accounting. 3 of his soldiers wouldn't return to their villages, wouldn't see their families again, wouldn't grow old in the country they'd fought to defend. The Americans had been better than expected, better equipped, better trained, and more clever than the foreigners Ba had tracked before. There was no shame in acknowledging that, no dishonor in recognizing that the enemy had fought well. The jungle had taught Ba many lessons over the years, and tonight it had taught him a new one. Sometimes the prey has teeth, and underestimating those teeth can be fatal. His men would recover, would hunt again, would continue the war that had already consumed years of their lives. But they'd remember the Americans with the radio who'd turned the jungle against them, if only for a few terrible hours. Jimmy Dalton completed his tour in Vietnam and returned to Asheville in August 1968, 3 weeks after his daughter was born. He held her for the first time in the hospital nursery, this tiny, perfect human who had no idea what her father had done to make sure he'd be there for that moment. Sarah took one look at his face and knew something fundamental had changed, though it would take Jimmy years to articulate what that something was. He went back to work at the lumber mill, raised his daughter, added a son 2 years later, and lived what looked like a normal life from the outside. But some nights he'd wake up in a cold sweat, hearing the sound of artillery in his dreams, feeling the weight of the PRC-25 on his shoulders, tasting the metallic fear of being hunted in a jungle half a world away. The men who served in LRRP teams during Vietnam performed a mission that required extraordinary skill, courage, and discipline. They operated beyond the reach of immediate support, gathered intelligence that saved countless lives, and accepted risks that most soldiers never had to face. Jimmy's service was real. His courage was real. The weight he carried for decades afterward was real. But the larger questions, why American soldiers were conducting reconnaissance missions near the Cambodian border, whether those missions advanced any achievable strategic objective, whether the cost in lives and trauma was justified by the outcomes, those questions belong to policy and politics, not to the men who executed their missions with honor and professionalism. They did their part. They served when called. The fault, when there was fault, lay in the decisions made far from the jungle floor. Ba survived the war and lived into his 70s, working as a farmer in the same province where he'd once hunted American soldiers. He rarely spoke of those years, but when he did, he spoke with respect for the foreign soldiers who'd proven to be worthy opponents. War had created tragedy on all sides, had taken men from families, had left scars that never fully healed. The Tactical Victory Team 3-2 achieved that day in January 1968 didn't change the war's outcome, didn't advance American objectives, didn't prevent the eventual communist victory 7 years later. But for 6 American soldiers and their families, that single firefight in the jungle meant everything. It meant fathers who came home to daughters, sons who grew up with dads, husbands who kept the promises they'd made to wives, That kind of meaning doesn't need strategic justification. If you're watching this, you understand that military history is ultimately about people. The ones who served, the ones who waited for them to come home, and the ones who carry the memories forward when the soldiers themselves can no longer tell their stories. Subscribe now and join those who refuse to let these experiences fade into footnotes. These men deserve to be remembered, not just as data points in historical analyses, but as human beings who faced impossible situations with courage and skill. Honor their service. Remember their names. Question the policies that put them in harm's way. That's the least we can do.